Welcome to season 2 of My 3 Questions. My name is Andrew Mayer, and I'm all about sharing experiences. On this show, I round up professionals that are working in the broader world of experiences here, just so I can ask them 3 simple questions. Honestly, because I only want to hear their responses. On today's show, I've got Rob Kurver. He is CEO and co-founder of APIology. I recently met him at an API Days event in Amsterdam. And Rob, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks, Andrew. Great to be here.
So for the crowd here, I've talked to a lot of people in the communication space. Of course, I come from contact center, customer experience sort of world, but in the broader world of communications, could you just explain what is an API for layman's?
So for layman's, I think this is a good question. Everybody always asks this question, right? We have all these API events and API this and API that, and every tool nowadays has an API, and nobody really knows what an API is. I think a lot of people mean different things with the word API. So in general, it's like an interface. It's an application programming interface. So it allows a program to interface with, let's say, another program. I've heard somebody say APIs is the way programs have sex, which is kind of a funny way to look at APIs. If you look at it in the API Days context or the apiology context, we like to look at it as the way for bits and pieces of programs to be reused, right? They run everywhere. They're microservices typically. They run somewhere in the world in this big cloud that we have nowadays. And the API is the interface that allows any developer basically to access and to reuse that component, which leads to faster development times, shorter development times, I should say, more agility, and also to a whole host of challenges, of course, in this whole new IT architecture, which is keeping a lot of us busy. I think words for IT, because the monolith of the old days, I was a developer 35 years ago. I used to do programming by, let's say, starting at the start and writing assembly or C code and then ending at the end. And if you did this for long enough, you would have a program. That's not how it works anymore. We live in a world where it's about more experimentation, reuse of existing components, putting things together quickly, see if things work or resonate. So I think APIs are the way forward in this world, and they're very interesting. Also, if you look at it, if you look at the telecom domain, which is what I like to do. My background for the past 15 years has been in hosting voice and UC as a service, and that sort of stuff. And now we see that those monolithical solutions are being taken down into microservices. So a lot of times when we talk about APIs in a telco context, we mean CPaaS, communication platforms as a service. So we talk about SMS API, a way to send SMSs real easily and quickly and sometimes cheaply, or voice API. So you can do smart things with voice. So from that perspective, APIs really give us in the telco industry a very interesting way to build new communications solutions into our mobile apps or server apps or whatever, and it gives a whole load of new innovation basically in this industry that was frankly a little bit boring a couple of years ago.
Okay, I'll take the boring, having been in this industry for a very large provider for 25 years now. But it's been a big transition, right? And 25 years ago, the world of communications was much simpler, right? Basically, we had phone, we had fax, email started to come around. It was very, very simple. And I think your point about the role of APIs is communications are coming from a lot of different places now, whether it's IoT, your washing machine talking to a platform, sending messages, is part of the communication equation that won't be controlled by the telco, right? The telco doesn't have all those connectors, pieces that are out there. And that's exactly where the APIs come into play, right?
Right. Yeah, so it's interesting. I had a discussion this morning with somebody about telco and the role of the telco. And basically, I mean, we ended up talking about the word telco. What's a telco these days, right? So maybe we should start we should stop talking about telco and start talking more about communication service provider.
Mm.
Because then it's clear that we're not talking about telecommunication or telephone or the tel thing so much anymore, right? It's communication. Communication comes in many different forms. And I know a couple of years ago when we were thinking about unified communications, that was a big thing, right? And maybe a couple of years ago,
Sure.
we went from hosted voice, and now it was UCAS. And I remember some of the early Broadsoft shows, for example, when they started talking about this to telcos, and everyone was going, well, what is this stuff? I mean, what are we unifying? And I think that was only a couple of years ago. And since then, we added, let's say, to the mix of voice and video and maybe SMS, we added things like all these social channels that people live in, right? So what's really important nowadays, and what's the role then for the traditional telco, and what's the challenge and the opportunity for the telco? I think that's a very interesting question. I think there's both a huge challenge, right, for a traditional telco. They may get reduced to be just the carrier and just the bit pipe. And there's nothing wrong with being a bit pipe. I mean, we all need bit pipes, and like we all need roads. But
Sure.
it may not be as sexy as being a transportation company. So in communication service provider, I like to think of a company, an organization that offers, that builds and offers solutions to their customers that relate to communications in the widest sense. Through digital means. Let's stick to the digital part, because otherwise it gets very, very broad. But there's so much happening right now. The last couple of years we've seen, so I just called it boring because a couple of years ago we had a PBX, and then we put a PBX in the cloud, and then we started adding maybe a little bit of video, and then WebRTC came along, and all of a sudden everything was possible, and then social came along, and then all these mashups, and now we live in a time where communication is not the solution anymore. It's the means to get to a solution, right? It's part of the solution. Any app that we use, any service that we consume, we sort of expect communication to be a relevant part where when it's necessary, right? When I use an app to do my banking thing, I expect communication to be somehow there when I need it, to talk to somebody or to chat to somebody. So I think it totally turned around, where a couple of years ago, communication was like the driver for a lot of processes. Now I like to think that communication is like the added bit that makes services interesting or low friction, or actually fun to use or useful.
Fulfilling. Right.
Fulfilling,
that interaction with your bank that might be all digital with your thumbs getting everything done, but if it's needed that you have to interact with somebody, it fulfills that exchange that you're having.
Right. And I think the challenge that we have in this industry is to use all these different channels at the right time, at the right place, right? And deal with the preferences of each individual user, deal with the maybe regulatory requirements that may exist, or deal with technical constraints, bandwidth or whatever, and provide the best possible user experience in any given situation. So it's putting people first instead of putting technology first, which is what I really like about this phase of this industry. And everybody's sort of struggling with what it means and how to do it, and where to start, and there's just so many, well, as I said, so many challenges for the more traditional players that don't see that they need to adapt or don't really know how to adapt. But there's also so many opportunities for new players, or I think for the legacy players that are looking to change and that make use of all the possibilities.
It gives us a lot to do, and that's great for us. And hopefully we can help the industry and clients out there to find their way through the mess of the boringness into the new world. But I asked you here for 3 questions, and that was just the warm-up question. So let me No, no worries. Let me jump into my first question. It's gonna segue right well into what you were just saying. The event that you and I met at in June in Amsterdam again had the byline "The Rise of Contextual Communications." Really aimed towards the CPaaS, these communication platforms, the telcos. Not only them, but them being as an anchor. Why did you choose that byline, or why was that such an important focus of the event in June?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, it's pretty much what I just said a minute ago, right? The communications is not something that we choose maybe the way we used to choose it in the past. It's part of the context. I like to think that the way we communicate with somebody or something is really dependent on the context, both technical context, but also let's say, the user preference and the issue at hand. And it may change. It may no longer. In the good old days, we would either make a phone call or a video call or send a letter or an email. And I think nowadays, I mean, the challenges and the great customer experience is given by having all these different means of communications, depending on the context at exactly the right time. As I said, it's about putting the person first rather than the technology that happens to be available first.
That's it. That's it. And I think that's an important key, particularly for people like me in my industry. We're always have our technology is what we focused on, and we want to get the technology in place and get it to do good things. But often we need to turn that whole view around and say who's going to make use of this, whether it's a customer or an employee in the office or whoever's using this technology. I read an interesting article just recently talking about, so in the customer care business, we've been talking for 5, 6, 8 years around the omni-channelness. So trying to bring all these channels together, chat, video, voice, whatever it is, to make it a omni-channel experience. And this article was talking about there is no such thing as omni-channel. There is only one channel, and that's the customer. The customer is the channel. The rest of it is technology. And yes, as a supplier of technology, we deal with channels and technologies and try to make sense of those. But exactly to your comment there, if we turn this around the other way and say, what does the person want? How do they want it? When do they want it? How would they like to receive it? And if we have enough information and enough context, and I love the words and the title for the event in June, that contextual communications is what makes it all rich and fulfilling.
Right.
So
yeah, I like what you say about the omni-channel thing, because I tend to think that we got omni-channel more or less covered a couple of years ago when there were fewer channels, right? For fewer,
sure.
And nowadays, I mean, most brands don't have omni-channel anymore. I think they have multi-channel. And they do some channels well because they have put innovation teams on new channels, social, for example.
Sure.
And then they tend to, and so everybody's struggling on putting all these channels back together and making it into a smooth, low friction user experience, because we sort of get that that's important. And I think the technology is all there. I mean, there's just so much technology out there that can do this, that can deliver this, that can support us in decision making, etc. And going back to the whole API thing, I think the power of API and CPaaS is by delivering those bits and pieces of technologies for the different channels, for the different decision making components, etc. We're empowering millions of developers worldwide to develop solutions that are optimal for a certain situation. Back in the days where the telcos or UCaaS companies were developing solutions, we needed a lot of very smart telco developers or telco engineers.
Specialist knowledge.
Specialist knowledge, right? There's 10,000 people that know SS7 or something like that in the world, right? Whereas there's hundreds of millions of developers that know or that can use WebRTC and APIs and CPaaS platforms. So we're just empowering all these developers to build smarter solutions, better solutions, for specific use cases. And I think that's the big change that we're going through right now with APIs and CPaaS maturing. And as I like to think, we're going through the chasm with this new technology, right? It used to be very technical way, again, that we're marketing to developers and to technologists. And now we're at this point in time where regular people ask me, what's an API? And I'm supposed to give them an answer that's not so technical, but it's a way to increase the speed of innovation and to build better user experience and to make basically the world a better place and at lower cost, etc. By taking by removing that very deep technical knowledge barrier that we used to have, certainly in our industry.
So you basically answered my second question, was what needs to happen so we see significant change in this industry? And I think one piece of it you've already answered, saying the APIs and the platforms, whether they're existing platforms are becoming more open, newer platforms are being built already open with the APIs, are obviously giving access to features, functions, solutions that in the past used to be closed off behind walled gardens of the worlds of businesses and solution providers. Lots of developers are jumping on the opportunities, taking advantage to build things here, not needing specialist knowledge. But how do we get it into the company? How do we get it into the large retail big box company that they understand, or a traditional bank, which are using lots of APIs when it comes to retail banking and other things from in the back end of banking. But when it comes to the communications world, they're still very traditional, right? It's the phone lines, it's maybe, the Facebook page, it's email, and the website. How do we get them to approach these changes?
So one thing I see there is the technology is there, right? There's startups, there are CPaaS platforms. You can go online, take your credit card, and you can use that, which is great for developers that want to innovate and experiment. The challenge that we have to solve over the next couple of years is one not so much of technology, but maybe more of governance and security and compliance. Because for these banks to use these new technologies that are not running in their own basement, basically, right? They're using cloud services everywhere. The challenge becomes that we need to build a full chain of trust from the technology provider, the communication service provider, to the, let's say, the enterprise that's using it and building it and making it part of the solution. Because we will want to know, for example, when you're interacting with your bank, it's kind of important, right? Who's running that conversation? Where's this data ending up? And where is it being stored? And where is the transcription being made? All these great use cases, they come with a governance thing, a security thing, a reluctance, and that makes the larger, more traditional enterprises, I think, rightfully very concerned about deploying these sorts of services. So this is why I think it's so important that we not only have, let's say, startups and scale-ups that deliver CPaaS platforms or any kind of microservices access through an API. We need some of the, let's say, legacy organizations, like our telcos, our traditional telcos, like the UCaaS technology providers that have been around for a while, that have a certain reputation and a certain knowledge in these areas. I think we need them to also step up to the plate and to take that role, which is for them also both a challenge and I think a huge opportunity. I think this is something that we're going to see more of in the next couple of years. Just as we saw, it was a bit similar to when cloud started, maybe 10 years ago. Nobody knew what it was until we started to trust the big cloud providers and say, okay, we're probably good with these guys. And they got their SLAs and they're agreements and everything in place, and we build a legal framework to deal with it. And we're sort of, it's still very complex, but we're getting there. And I think the same needs to happen now for APIs and for the microservices behind the APIs, which are they're adding another level of complexity, right? 5 or 10 years ago, the big question for a large enterprise was which cloud provider to trust. And now the question is, how do I trust 100 or 1,000 API providers? Well, how do I do that? How do we manage that? I think we'll get there because there's no other way to do it. And I think in the meantime, it's important that we work on those frameworks, and we get more, let's say, more mature technology providers to complement the startups and scale-ups that are inventing stuff.
Sure.
And of course, that's only a matter of time. If you look at the larger, in the US, the last couple of years, a lot of the UCaaS providers acquired CPaaS platforms, right?
Right.
Just recently, 8x8 made an acquisition. And you can see the same thing happening in different parts of the world. And there's a couple of CPaaS enablers that are playing into that game. So I think we'll get there. And it's as I said, we're in this phase of crossing the chasm. So instead of it's only great new technology for the early adopters and the innovators, we're now trying to sell this sort of technology, these sorts of solutions to less technical people that have less technical issues, like compliance, like governance, like how do I keep track of this? They're a little bit more risk averse, which is fine. That's how the world works. So, as you said a couple of minutes ago, it's very interesting times.
It's I think you mentioned about the maturity, right? So the maturity of the cloud service provider, the maturity of the API offers out there are coming quickly, and we're seeing a lot of adoption happening in certain areas. I see the other side of the enterprise puzzle in that is there's a lot of I think there's a lot of retirement that has to happen. Honestly, I meet people that I can tell are 10 years or fewer years away from their retiring from the company, and they don't want to take the risk, right? So they understand the opportunity, they understand that that's probably the future, but a lot of them are blocking, right? They just don't want to take the risk on of such a project of changing the way they do their business, risking whatever that might mean for them in their careers. I don't know, but I think we're going to see this in the next few years, quite a bit of a change from that side as well, where we're going to have new people coming into roles of making decisions, running parts of the business there, and having grown up through the maturity of these cloud services and other providers. And I suspect in the next 5 years, we're going to see a very big sea change of crossing that chasm, where we'll be on the other side, and we won't be having these conversations about what is an API anymore. That'll be old conversation, old tech there. Listen, I've got you out on your busy workday. I have one last question for you. It's a really hard one, Rob. If you had more time in your day, what would you do with it?
I would probably relax more. I would work out more. I think we spend in our society, and we work way too much. And there's so many fun things to do and so many important things to do. And I think if I had more time in my day, I would really try to relax more, read more books, and do more of the things I remember doing when I was a kid. And I don't have time for that anymore. And I think that's a shame. And also travel. I'm lucky that I get to travel a lot for work, which is one of the things I love doing. But investigating and learning new things, I mean, that's for me is all part of travel and being in different situations. I think we need more. Almost everybody today needs more of that.
That's a very honest and a very true human response there. I appreciate you coming in today on my show here. Rob Kurver of Apiology, also a participant of the API Days there. Rob, where can people find you on the internet if they want to learn more about what you're doing?
Okay, just go to apiology.io. or epidays.io, and you'll see all about our company and the events that we're doing together with the API Days Global Organization.
All right. All those links are going to be down here below, so you can find Rob. Rob, thank you for coming in today, and look forward to hooking up with you another time real soon.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.